born like mute and blind and just can't talk, can't hear, can't do anything, and they accidentally stab someone, would they be responsible?
But
Even
then
if they don't know they stabbed someone?
But then if someone else in like the exact same situation, someone who is like capable, kills someone, and then they get punished while the person who isn't doesn't, then and doesn't suffer anything, then is it fair to the other person?
Well, I think it is.
Does punishing someone offer a solution?
Well, if it doesn't offer a solution, then why do we have jails?
Well, we're not discussing the merits of punishment. We're just talking about like should they be able to be held accountable. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on from this moral agents discussion. Does anyone have any questions on this?
It's hard.
It is a tough question. Okay, Joey just told me that they're new. What does he do? So right now we're talking about moral frameworks and moral agents. It's going to be kind of hard to catch you up because it's been 20 minutes, but I'll send the recorded video after this meeting. Okay, so now we're going to talk about 3 specific moral frameworks. These are consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And we're probably only going to get to 2 of them this lesson due to time limitations. So we're going to talk about the 2 most prevalent ones, which were the first 2. The first one is called consequentialism. So consequentialism is defined as the doctrine that the morality of an action is to be judged solely by its consequences. So when we remember back to the trolley problem, if your answer was something like, we should always do the thing that saves more lives, or we should always do the thing that maximizes happiness, something like that, then you're thinking like a consequentialist, because you're thinking that the moral of these things are judged solely by its consequences. So there's several key things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about consequentialism. The first thing is that when we talk about consequences, we're talking about the expected consequences. This is important because people cannot read the future. So as an example, let's say that someone buys a lottery ticket and they win $1 million. Does this mean that consequentialism thinks that he should keep buying lottery tickets? No, because the expected consequence is not to win $1 million. In general, the expected consequence is to lose some money. The second thing is that consequences are aggregate, meaning that you have to consider the net consequence on every person involved. So just to give another example, let's say that you steal $1,000 from your friend. Initially, you might say, well, according to consequentialism, I get good consequences because I'm stealing money and I'm getting money. However, consequentialism deals with the consequences on everyone. So you also have to consider the consequence of, for example, breaking the law and the consequence on the person that you're stealing the money from. The third thing is that consequentialism considers both long-term and short-term consequences. This one is pretty straightforward. So now the central question is, so we know that consequentialism deals with consequences, but what consequences are we talking about? Like, what do we actually want to maximize or to achieve? So on the screen, I listed several examples, maybe happiness, truth, money, life, utility. What are some other examples that you guys can think of that would be a good consequence? And in the meantime, here I'll read the chat. Wow, the chat is going very fast. And once again, if you'd like to speak, you can just unmute yourself and speak. You don't have to raise your hand. Okay, so someone asked in chat, let's say that if everyone in your class jumps off a cliff and dies, would you say that that's a good choice as well? Wait, this discussion is kind of not what we're talking about right now.
Plus, who would do that?
Logic.
Okay, we can go back to that discussion later about what is discussion about? I'm not entirely sure what
jumping off a cliff.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but let's get, oh, it's an answer to another question. I see. We can get back to that later. For now, let's answer the question at hand, which is, what are some other examples of consequences that are good?
Probably interpersonal relationships, like
Okay,
making friends.
okay. Oh, I see, Kelly. That was the question. Well, we can talk about that at the end of the meeting, but I want to get past everything first right now. So,
这个这样子就
okay, let's move on then. The next thing that we're going to talk about is utilitarianism. So, as we can see on the chart in the top right, there's a Venn diagram that nicely illustrates the relationship between utilitarianism and consequentialism. So utilitarianism is a type of consequentialism in which the consequence that you're trying to maximize is happiness or utility. So that means that the action that gives the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people should be the guiding principle of conduct. There's two key figures in the utilitarian that have contributed greatly to utilitarianism. The first person is on the left. He's called Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham says that the ultimate moral goal is to maximize happiness for all moral agents. There's no difference between types of happiness. He thinks that all types of happiness are the same, except in degree. And in addition, he says that he thinks that morality is kind of like a math equation. So when we're adding up happinesses, if something brings a net positive happiness, then the action is moral. So does anyone have any questions about Bentham? Okay. The second person that we're going to talk about is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is another very important, highly influential utilitarian philosopher. What he said is that he agrees with Jeremy Bentham that things that maximize happiness are the best. However, the key difference is that Bentham thinks that when we're talking about happiness, there's only differences in quantity. There's no differences in quality. However, John Stuart Mill thinks that actually there's difference in quantity and quality, meaning that he thinks that there's some types of happiness that are of higher quality than other types of happiness. So just to give an example, that John Stuart Mill says that reading a really good novel brings you happiness, and rolling around in the mud brings a pig happiness. But John Stuart Mill thinks that the happiness that you experience by reading the novel is of higher quality than the happiness that the pig experiences when the pig is rolling around in the mud. So what does everyone think about this distinction in happiness? This distinction between Bentham's version of happiness, which is in which the only difference is really quantity, versus John Stuart Mill, who thinks that there's differences in quality as well. Tony says John Stuart Mill. Okay, so what is your reasoning? Different levels of enjoyment. Okay. Well, different levels of enjoyment, I would say, is mostly about the quantity of happiness, because that's something that is really numeric that you can quantify. Whereas the quality of happiness is more about, it's more of an abstract thing that it's hard to quantify, but we just intuitively know that it's there, or maybe we don't. That's the question.
Wait, are we talking about like
So we're talking about right now if you think that there's a difference in the quality of different types of happiness. Going back to the example, do you think that the happiness that someone experiences when reading a novel is the same as the happiness that a pig receives from rolling around in the mud? Or are they just different because of quality?
Well, I think it all just depends on the whoever's enjoying it, because to a human it's better to enjoy a book, but to a pig it's better to roll around in the mud because it's a pig. So they're like different things, because a pig can't read a book.
Okay, so you would agree with Bentham?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to read the chat really quickly. Okay, so Eric says that he thinks that there's a formula to compare the benefit you get when you act. That's exactly what both utilitarian philosophers would think. Okay, so before we move on from utilitarianism and consequentialism, does anyone have any questions about either of them, or about Bentham or John Stuart Mill? Okay, so just to really quickly recap, consequentialism is the doctrine where we're only considered about consequences. And by the way, if anyone has any questions throughout the lecture, feel free to type them in chat. I'll try to respond. Now we're going to move on to deontology. Deontology is the opposite of consequentialism. Deontology says that the morality of an action should be based on whether or not that action itself is right or wrong under a series of rules, rather than based on the consequences of the action. So going back to the trolley problem, if you said, well, I don't care about the consequences, we only care about the whether or not you directly kill someone. Or if you said, we don't care about consequences, we only care about whether or not, I don't know, whether or not you feel guilt or something like that. All of those are deontological frameworks because they all say that we have to follow a series of rules when we're deciding what to do. So the question here is, what rules are important? Like, which rules should we follow? So here I list several examples. Maybe always help others, never kill others. What are some other examples of rules that everyone can think of? Promote human rights. Okay. That's a good one, actually. Never murder others. Okay. Yeah, once again, these are just examples of rules. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying that they're good examples. Minimize pain. That's another good one. Well, actually, Kelly, for both of yours, promote human rights and minimize pain, they're both kind of in the gray area because, I mean, minimizing pain means that you're trying to minimize the consequence of pain. So that's kind of like consequentialism. Something that's more of a deontological framework is never cause pain. Because in that case, it doesn't matter how much pain you cause. You're not trying to minimize or maximize anything. You're only trying to do something that is to not cause pain at all. So Shengyao Liu gives a good example. Do not steal from others. No weapons allowed. That's another good example. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Okay. Be evil. That would not be a good moral framework, but I guess that's an example. Okay. So just like before, there's two main people that have been at the forefront of deontological ethics. Before I talk about these two people, Kant and Ross, does anyone have any questions on deontology? Okay, so everyone's clear on that. That's good. Once again, if you have questions, please type them in the chat. I want to make sure everyone is following along. So let's first talk about Kant. Has anyone heard of Kant before? This person is actually very famous. Okay, well, regardless of that, Kant is arguably the single person who has contributed the most to deontological ethics. I'm surprised that not many of you know him, but I guess now you do. So essentially what Kant says is that there's this categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative is very complicated. I'm not going to go in depth on it, but just to summarize it in a very basic way, it states that actions are right or wrong. All actions are right or wrong, and wrong actions are always wrong. Meaning that if there's a wrong action, then it doesn't matter the circumstances. It doesn't matter how many people you save or how much happiness you cause. You can never do it. So just to further emphasize the categorical imperative and Kant's philosophy, there's a famous story where someone asked Kant, so Kant, let's say that there's an axe murderer at your house, and the axe murderer asks you, I'm trying to kill your mother. Where's your mother? And you know that your mother is actually hiding in the house. So the person asked Kant, what would you say? And Kant would say, well, I probably wouldn't lie. So I would say, yes, my mom is in the room. So that really illustrates kind of the extremity of Kant's position. But that also illustrates the fact that Kant's position was very problematic, because not lying there is most people would say that that's very unreasonable, because obviously you would want to save your mother instead of not lying. Before I go into W.D. Ross, who tries to solve this problem, does anyone have any questions on Kant?
Didn't Kant go insane near the end of his life?
Did he? I'm not sure. That's irrelevant.
Okay.
Are you thinking of Nietzsche? Or maybe he did. I'm not completely sure. Okay, so for everyone in the chat who's saying that lying might not be bad, let's just assume that it is bad. I know that sometimes it's not, but let's just assume that we're using it as an example. Okay, so let's move on to W.D. Ross. Obviously, we can see that there's many problems with Kant's philosophy. Many of his ideas are simply too rigid and impossible to apply to real life. So W.D. Ross tried to reconcile that problem. He tried to find a way to maintain Kant's deontological philosophy while making it more accessible and solving a lot of the problems. So what Ross did is that he developed a system where there's many different types of duties that can override each other. Meaning that one obligation, for example, the obligation to lie, might be less important than the obligation to save your mother. Meaning that you would choose to uphold the latter obligation over the obligation to not lie. So W.D. Ross gave several examples of obligations. In his list, there were 8 obligations. There was fidelity, reparation, gratitude, non-injury, harm prevention, beneficence, self-improvement, and justice. And these are just some examples of possible obligations to have. And so now there's a key issue with Ross's philosophy, and the issue is, how do you decide which obligation is more important than another obligation? And Ross's answer was that it just depends. We have to use our intuition. So for example, Ross would say, in the case of the axe murderer asking for your mother, you would obviously not tell the truth, because it's very obvious that your obligation to save your mother is greater than your obligation to tell the truth to the axe murderer. Nicholas says it's not that obvious. Well, I'm saying what Ross would say. I'm not saying what I personally think or what I would think is right. I'm just saying that that's what Ross would say. Okay, so the problem with this is that there's some examples where you could say that it's obvious, right? But there's other examples where it's not so obvious. And there's other examples where one person's intuition could be different from another person's intuition. And Ross never really was able to resolve this issue. This is a key issue with deontological ethics, which is the fact that you don't know when you should do something because you don't know when one obligation is more valuable than another obligation. Okay, so that's it for both consequentialism and deontology. Does anyone have any questions on